Hi, my name is Marie Romagnano, founder of Healthcare Professionals for Divine Mercy. I'm happy to present to you our educational conferences that integrate medicine, bioethics, and the spirituality of divine mercy in patient care for healthcare professionals. Because of their importance, even if you're not a medical professional, we invite you to join us. Today, I wish to summarize a conference presentation given by Father Mark Yavaronne on the current issues in bioethics. Father Mark is an oblate of the Virgin Mary. He is a bioethicist and former cell biologist. Father Yavaronne begins his presentation by describing some core principles that underlie the teachings of the Catholic Church about how to lead a truly happy life. The Church's teachings are based on virtue and the natural law ethic. In this perspective, certain actions such as murder, theft, and slander are contrary to the perfection of our own nature, and we do well to avoid them. Other human actions such as prayer, marriage, and earning a wage can be a perfective of human nature, and we do well to perform these actions under the proper circumstances. One way of knowing whether an action is perfective is through natural law. As Dr. Charles Rice has said, the natural law is a set of manufacturer's directions written into our nature so that we can discover through reason how we ought to act. Contrary to this view is the position held by some in the medical profession and society at large. Human nature is simply raw material to be shaped in accord with our freedom. Human beings can decide for themselves what will perfect them. Actions such as abortion, sexual reassignment surgery, and assisted suicide represent legitimate uses of human freedom to determine ourselves. Father Mark then applies the virtue natural law ethic to particular moral questions at the beginning and end of human life. He begins with the former and discusses in vitro fertilization, including the recent engineering of babies with DNA from 3 parents, germline genetic engineering, and somatic cell genetic engineering. Of these, only the last can be consistent with human flourishing. Father Mark concludes the latter by looking at end-of-life issues, including the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of prolonging life, and an update on the legality of euthanasia and assisted suicide in the U.S. and abroad. I invite you to listen to the complete talk of Father Mark Yavaronne as he discusses current issues in bioethics.
First of all, if I could just offer a little bit of a correction, just so you don't think I'm from some fringe group, I do not teach at John Paul III Seminary. Pope St. John the 23rd Seminary. So. But it's very nice to be back. This is actually my 4th year here at the conference. And 3 years ago, I gave a couple of talks on current trends in bioethics. 2 years ago, I talked about decision-making in healthcare. Last year, I gave a rather technical talk on Plan B, the abortifacient properties of Plan B. So Marie and I thought it would be good to kind of return to the topic that I did 3 years ago, because there are always new trends in bioethics that we need to be aware of and look to the wisdom of the Church to illumine in some way. So I want to begin by giving a little bit of an overview, the Church's view of what we could call the moral life. The Church's view of, why it's good to do some things and not good to do other things. And then from that framework, I want to talk about 3 or 4 current trends in bioethics in the hour or so that we have together this morning. So, first of all, core principles. So I'll begin with the Church's vision of the moral life and say a few words about human dignity, which is really the basis for the Church's teaching on bioethics. So So this is how I deal with the topic with my students. I give them a little picture, you know. I call them my kids, even though many of them are older than I am. You know, I teach at a seminary for delayed vocations. This is how I explain it to my kids. That picture there is you. You know, backpack is optional. And you are traveling on the path of life, and you are made in the image of God, imago Dei. You are made in the image and likeness of God. So here you go, and you're trying to get to your final end, or your final goal. What's your final goal? Very good. And the Catechism uses a few different phrases for that, a few different ways of explaining it. So, beatitude, true and lasting happiness. You see, in the Catechism, it begins, the section on the moral life begins with our vocation to beatitude, God calling us to true and lasting happiness with Him. And there are a few other descriptions of that final end or final goal that are given in the Catechism. Kingdom of God, the vision of God, entering into the joy of the Lord, eternal rest. You know, when I was younger, eternal rest didn't really turn me on too much, but now as I get older, eternal rest starts to sound better and better. Participation in the divine nature, St. Peter says in one of his epistles, that God has become man so that we can actually participate in God's very nature. When we get to heaven, we're not just going to be looking at God from the outside. We're going to be participating in His very being in some way, and that's a participation that can begin now in this life. The joy of Trinitarian life. These are all different ways of describing our final goal. And part of the wisdom of the Church is that that path passes by way of the human act. In other words, what we do has something to do with where we end up. So the path to beatitude passes through our acts, our actions. And there are some actions which, simply because of the kind of action that they fall short of the perfection of our human nature. They are not conducive to human flourishing. That's another way of saying it. They are not conducive to true and lasting happiness. And I have some of those kinds of actions listed in no particular order, and I've chosen the most clear and most plain ones, the ones that most obviously contradict one of the commandments. And those things fall short, not just because God says so, but because they violate some personal good, some basic human good in a very basic way. So I have some of those goods listed. And if you notice, whoops, where's the laser? There we go. These goods, if you look at these evil actions, they all violate at least one of those goods in some very basic way. So they are not conducive to our perfection. They are not conducive to our flourishing. Obviously, murder violates the good of human life. And without human life, we can't enjoy any of the other goods that God has created. Adultery violates the good of marriage, family life, marital union. Slander violates the good of friendship, also the good of human communication, which is made for truth-telling, one of the things we need in order to flourish with each other. Theft violates the good of private property, and so forth. Now, this is important to realize because when we say that a certain kind of action, and I'm going to be speaking mostly in this talk about certain medical technologies or medical procedures, when we say that they are wrong, when we say that they are not good, we are not just Catholics who are saying the Catholic thing and talking about doing the Catholic thing. We're saying that there are certain things, like abortion or in vitro fertilization, for example, which simply do not conduce, they do not promote human flourishing. They do not promote these goods. They're not going to help to get us here. They're not going to help to get us to that perfection, that flourishing that we're all looking for. Now, here's another very important piece of the picture, and that is everything that I choose to do, every act that I freely choose, not only has an effect out here in the world and on other people, but it also has an effect on me. It shapes me into the kind of person that I am. So this is the whole reality of the virtues and the vices that the Catechism speaks quite a bit about. If they are good actions, they develop the virtues in me. If they are evil actions, they develop the vices in me. So we have 4 basic human virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. They help to make us truly happy. This is a very important point. Virtue is something that we enjoy. I'll just take a simple example. I was driving here today, and if you look at the virtue of fortitude, it's also called bravery or courage. Fortitude has to do with pursuing the good even when there's some sort of big obstacle, especially death, right? Now, part of fortitude is the virtue that allows us to pursue the good in the face of a minor inconvenience. Not a grave obstacle, but a minor inconvenience. Does anybody know what you call that virtue? It's part of the virtue of fortitude. It has to do with pursuing the good in the face of a minor inconvenience. It's called patience. Okay, that's what patience is, right? It's part of the virtue of fortitude. Patience is something we enjoy. If you're driving on the Mass Pike, would you rather have your heart beating 140 times a minute or 70 times a minute? Virtue, like patience and all the other virtues, is something we enjoy. It's something that we want. It's something that perfects us. Now, where does Christ come into all of this? Because we could get a lot of this from the philosophers, right? The virtues, living a truly good human life, all of this. Well, I think our battery might be winding down here. So this gives an opportunity to test patience. Again, virtue is something that we enjoy. This is absolutely not moving. Do we have another clicker? Oh, okay. All right, very good. Let's hope it stays on. So first of all, we're created through him, right? As we say in the Creed, through him all things were made, right? Jesus was there from the beginning. He became man 2,000 years ago, but he was always there with the Father. We were created through him. He elevates our final goal by becoming man. So our goal is not just living a good human life now. It's something much higher. The kingdom of God, the vision of God, which is made possible through Christ. He's our companion on the way. So he doesn't just say, here's what you have to do in order to be happy, now go do it. Right? He says, follow me, learn from me. I am meek and humble of heart. So the way to beatitude is the way of the Beatitudes, following Christ, becoming like him. It's either feast or famine here. You get nothing or you get 5. Okay. His Paschal mystery justifies us. How beautiful that we're still in the Easter season when we have this conference. So that means a few things. He unites us into his body, the church. So you're not traveling by yourself, right? If there was enough room on this slide, I think I'd have a little church around you here, because we're all traveling together. He forgives our sins. He's mercy when we fall. So if we fall into one of these, Jesus doesn't just look at us and say, okay, bye-bye, you're on your own, right? He reaches down to us in our sin, in our lack, in our deficiency, and continues to love us and to lift us up. And what do we call that? God's love in the face of our sin and lack and weakness and deficiency? Mercy. Okay. Somehow I knew you'd all get that right. Good. He sanctifies us, so he gives us grace to choose the good, especially through the sacraments. And we get these 3 amazing new virtues, which are not natural, they are supernatural, that allow us to relate directly to God. An amazing thing. Through faith, hope, and charity, we can relate directly to him. So now, instead of just being just, for example, because I want to be a good human being, I'm going to do just things, and I want justice out of love for God and out of love for my brothers and sisters in God, right? It's a complete different level. So these theological virtues, as they call, relate us directly to God and to our brothers and sisters in God. And then finally, his grace makes it possible for us to give ourselves in a particular way according to our personal vocation, what Pope John Paul II used to call self-donation, self-giving. Most of you are called to give yourself to God by giving yourself to one particular family, one particular spouse, one particular set of children. Some of us are called to give ourselves in a more direct or a more immediate way by, let's say, religious life or priesthood. So that's the big picture of the moral life. You know, I kind of spend a whole semester with my kids talking about this, but I just want to focus on one part of this, and that is human dignity, which stems from the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God, the imago Dei. So, when we talk about human dignity, when we talk about being made in the image of God, what does that mean? You know, when I looked in the mirror this morning, you know, image of God is not the first thing I would have thought of, you know? So what does that mean to say we're made in the image of God? Well, first of all, we can think. So we talk about God's plan, you know, for our lives. There's an image of that, and that we can think, we can plan. You know, we have this ability of higher thought. We can talk about God's will, and there's an image of that, a reflection of that in the fact that we can choose. You know, we can freely choose things that sometimes even fly in the face of instinct, simply because they are good, they are conducive to our happiness in God. Please pray for the pointer that it starts working better than this. Okay. We can know and love the Creator. Now, this is something that no other creature can do. You know, you're never going to find, goodness gracious. I wonder if I could just ask for you to advance the slide manually. Would that be possible? Okay. Okay. So we can know and love the Creator. You're never going to see, for example, a grizzly bear praying. You know, he can't know and love the Creator. Have you all heard that story about the grizzly bear praying? No? Okay, well, now I have to tell it. So. The man being chased in the woods by a grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear backs him up against a barn. And the man is just, he cries out in prayer, and he says, "Lord, please make this a Catholic bear." And then he says to himself, why did I, well, maybe it's an inspiration. I'm just going to go with it. You know, "Lord, please make this a Catholic bear." And all of a sudden the bear kneels down, and he makes the sign of the cross, and he says, "Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive." It's not going to happen in real life. The bear can't know and love the Creator, right? Okay. We can know and make choices about ourselves. You know, self-reflection, this is something that God does perfectly, and we can do it. It's an image of what he can do. So, again, like your kitten is never going to think to herself, you know, what kind of a cat am I really turning into? You know, what kind of cat am I becoming? You know, we can do that. Other creatures cannot do that. We're called to share in God's own Trinitarian life. No other creature can even come close to that except perhaps the angels, right? So Jesus becomes man so that we can share in the divine nature and participate in God's life. And that leads to several conclusions. First of all, that human dignity is intrinsic. In other words, it's inherent. If you're human, you have it. Automatically. If you're human, you have it. Simply because you have human nature. You know, you either have it or you don't. Human dignity does not require any particular functions or capacities. Even if we're not doing any of these things at any particular moment, we still have a nature that's capable of doing those things. Human life is sacred, so human dignity is inviolable. It can't be lost. This would be in contrast to quality of life arguments as opposed to sanctity of life. Quality of life is important, but it is not the case that when your life falls below a certain quality, you no longer have human dignity. You retain human dignity because you're still human. As I heard one healthcare professional say very poignantly, human dignity does not reside in the bladder. Even if you completely lose your bodily functions, you don't lose your dignity, right? Human beings should never be treated as objects. Every person is a person to be loved and not an object to be used. Now, let's say the only time I ever talk to you is, when my clicker is not functioning. That's the only time I ever look at you and talk to you. And conference after conference, that's the only time I ever talk to you. Eventually, you're going to say to yourself, well, you're using me. I mean, to you, I'm not a person to be loved. I'm an object to be used. So, for example, the church is going to say, even if you could kill one human embryo and come up with a cure that would save 100,000 people, you still would not do it because each person, including that embryo, is a person to be loved and not an object to be used for some other end, for some other purpose. Human beings are equal. There is no discrimination in regard to human dignity. I may have to obey my superiors, for example, but I am equal in dignity to them. Children may have to obey their parents, but they are equal in dignity to their parents. No matter how small, no matter how young, no matter how old, no matter how strong, no matter how weak, human beings are equal in regard to human dignity. So all four of those that I've just mentioned are going to lead to the church's teaching on abortion and other life issues. It's rooted in human dignity, which comes from the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God. So I'm going to start at the beginning and say a few things about human procreation, because there are things going on right now that are very closely related to these things. I'm going to look at contraception, natural family planning briefly, early abortion, and then the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. I want to just mention where that is right now and where we stand in regard to it. So I'd like to sum up 3 ways of seeing the evil of contraception. These arguments also work with sterilization. Not everyone, of course, will agree with any of these 3 ways, but I think people usually see that there is at least something rational, something reasonable about them. So, first of all, reasonable human behavior. We act on behalf of ends that we perceive as good, don't we? Why did you eat breakfast this morning? Because you see nourishing yourself and maintaining your life as a good, right? Why did you come here to this conference? Because you see education, becoming more educated, as a good. Or even if you just did it to get the credits, you at least see getting the credits as a good, right? I mean, there's no other way we can act rationally except by acting on behalf of a good. Religious profession is a good. It's not a good that everyone is called to. Marriage is a good. It's not a good that everyone is called to, but it is a good. And if we act on behalf of any of those things, we do it because we perceive it as good in some way, right? Now, those things are good, but we don't need to act on behalf of those goods all the time, right? So, for example, nutrition is a good. But if I wake up one day and I notice that I can't see my toes anymore, I might start to diet. I might start to forego eating at times and in situations when I might usually do so. Okay, so I would refrain from that good on behalf of another good. Likewise, education is a good, But if one of you starts choking to death during my talk, please stop paying attention to my talk and help the person who's choking, right? Education is a good, but there's another good that you need to act on behalf of at that moment, right? Religious profession and marriage are goods, but I might discern that I need a little bit more time. I'm not ready to make my vows yet, or I'm not ready to get engaged yet. They're goods, but I don't need to act on behalf of those goods all the time, right? So I don't need to act on behalf of every good all the time, but it's not reasonable for me to act against those goods as though they were evil. So let's suppose now, for example, I'm going to eat, I'm going to pig out at breakfast, and then, Lord forbid, I'm going to go into the bathroom and I'm going to stick my finger down my throat. That would not be rational behavior because I'm engaging in a certain action, eating, and I'm acting against the good that is associated with that action, namely nourishing myself, okay? So some people will say, for example, well, what's the difference between contraception and natural family planning? They both do the same thing, right? There's a number of different ways of answering that question, but one of them is sort of like, what's the difference between dieting and eating and sticking your finger down your throat? In one case, you're simply refraining from engaging in a certain good. In the other case, you're engaging in the action and acting against the good that's associated with that action. So contraception is just that, contra, against conception. It is to act against the good of procreation that is proper to the conjugal act. Natural family planning simply involves refraining from the conjugal act, and therefore it can be good. In some situations it can be good. Okay, so that's one way of seeing it. Contraception acts against a good as though it were an evil. Another way of looking at it is this way. This is Paul VI kind of a classic treatment of this. Contraception separates the unitive and procreative aspects of the conjugal act. Or to put unitive and procreative very simply, babies and bonding. That's the way Janet Smith describes it. The two B's, bonding and babies. The two ends or the two purposes of the conjugal act. If we separate those two things, we are not going to flourish. Our families are not going to prosper, our marriages are not going to prosper, our society is not going to prosper. We need to keep those two things together. I like Janet Smith's point here is that if you have any doubt that those two are linked, unity and procreation, just look at the millions and millions of dollars that are spent every year trying to separate them. And despite that, we still have over 1 million abortions a year. Pope Paul VI, in fact, predicted 4 things that would happen if we separated these two aspects of the conjugal act. I'm not going to go through those 4 things here. They're in Humanae Vitae, but every single one of those 4 things have come true, and they're all bad. They're all bad for society, bad for ourselves. John Paul II had a little bit of a different twist on this. He talks about how contraception compromises the total self-giving of the spouses. In other words, the language of the sexual act is, I give myself to you totally, I accept you totally as you are. And what contraception does is it lays on top of that language a contradictory language. In other words, contraception is basically a lie. Because on the one hand, you're saying, I give myself to you totally, I accept you totally as you are. Now wait for a moment while I put on my barrier. Wait for a moment while I protect myself against you. Wait for a moment while I use some kind of chemical or physical barrier so that I will not give myself totally to you. I will withhold the fertility that is one of the goods that is associated with this action. When I've talked to younger people, I've said something like this. Imagine the love of your life, and they come to you and they look you in the eyes and they say, you know something? I really, really love you, but I hate your eyes. Could you close them? And hopefully you would say, well, wait a minute. If you love me, you have to love me the way I am. You have to accept me the way I am. That's a little bit like saying, I'm interested in you, I want to have this intimate union with you, but I am not interested in your fertility, so get rid of the problem somehow. Now, there are also extrinsic arguments against contraception, things that have to do not with so much what it is, but what it leads to. And here is a classic one given by John Paul II in the Gospel of Life. He says, "It is frequently asserted that contraception, if made safe and available to all, is the most effective remedy against abortion." This is the way just about everybody thinks except for the people in this room, or most of you, I suppose, huh? The best way to do away with abortion is to push contraception. In fact, people will say the church is responsible for abortion because the church opposes contraception. But, John Paul II says, the negative values inherent in the contraceptive mentality, which is very different from responsible parenthood lived in respect for the full truth of the conjugal act, are such that they in fact strengthen the temptation to abortion when an unwanted life is conceived. Indeed, the pro-abortion culture is especially strong precisely where the church's teaching on contraception is rejected. This is something that John Paul II noticed in all the countries that he traveled to throughout the world. If the contraceptive mentality is accepted in a certain country, abortion is going to follow contraception like night follows day. We also have the fact that sometimes contraception is abortion. As I think most of you know, some forms of contraceptives act after conception. So I always like to point out some of the facts about the first week after fertilization, the time between fertilization and implantation, because contraceptives that act between fertilization and implantation are actually abortive. They are abortifacients. So fertilization, for example, causes cell division to begin. You have a single cell sperm, single cell ovum. They're both at the end of the line. They're both going to die within a day or a few days if nothing else happens. Once fertilization occurs, now you have a new organism, and this new organism begins to divide his or her cells. The zygote, or the fertilized ovum, has a set of genes that is characteristic of a human being. Naturally, 46 chromosomes, and as most of you know, in about 2003, the work was finished on sequencing the human genome, so we can identify those genes as being specifically human genes, specifically human DNA. The plan of development, the plan of growth, is present from fertilization. So it doesn't come in at some later time. It unfolds beginning at fertilization, and that sex of the embryo is determined. So everybody in this room has either been XX or XY since fertilization. And at fertilization, the embryo begins self-directed development. The plan of growth comes from within the new life and not from outside. And so, you have this wonderful phrase at the beginning of the embryology textbook that I used in graduate school on page 3, first full page of text. It says, the development of a human being begins with fertilization. That's not a dogma of the church. It's just a fact of science, right? And so contraceptives that interfere with implantation, that in other words act between fertilization and implantation, are early abortifacients. And that's another reason to oppose them, to realize that they're not conducive to human flourishing. And then of course there's the side effects. I won't go through all of these. I'll just focus on 2. If you type into your search engine, World Health Organization, contraceptives, cancer, you will find your way to the release by the World Health Organization saying that contraceptives, oral contraceptives, cause breast cancer. Now, they will also say that it decreases the chance of some other kinds of cancer. But I think we all know that breast cancer is the biggest cancer problem facing women today, and so the overall effect on the woman's health in regard to cancer is not good. Also, one that I noticed recently, some of these have to do with blood clots. If you look on the website of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, it talks about how you can get blood clots on long plane flights. You've heard of that, right? And it actually says there The risk is increased if you are using an oral contraceptive. It says that right in an official organ of the United States government, Centers for Disease Control. You know, it's funny, kind of with everything else, we go green first, right? You know, let's see if we can get your cholesterol down naturally before we give you Lipitor, you know? But in this particular field, for some reason, the first thing doctors do is they reach for the pill, you know, instead of taking natural family planning seriously. It's a real inconsistency in some circles of medical practice. All right, so having talked about that, let's say a few things about the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act, which is facing us right now. Just a little bit of the history. Signed into law by President Obama back in 2010. It's been over 6 years. Isn't that amazing? You know? As you probably recall, 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on the individual mandate. That mandate requires every individual who does not have health insurance to purchase it. And the rationale that kind of got that Supreme Court decision over the top is that people who do not do this and who are penalized, that penalty can be seen as something of a tax, right? And therefore, the individual mandate was effectively approved. The ACA also says that employers with 50 or more full-time employees, or the equivalent thereof, basically must offer all of their full-time employees and their dependents, up to age 26, health coverage. Now, here's kind of the first sign of dirty pool, we might say. Notice 2 years after the bill is passed, Health and Human Services comes up with this rule. It's not in the original legislation that requires all group health plans to include reproductive, quote-unquote, preventive health services without copayment. In other words, as we're going to see, contraceptives, including some abortifacients, are considered reproductive preventive health services. They must be included in employer health plans, and they must be available to employees without a copay. Those quote-unquote services, you notice I'm going to put services in quotes all through this, because contraception and abortion are not services, but they're called services, so I put them in quotes. Include the full range of FDA-approved contraceptive drugs and devices, and those contraceptives and devices include several drugs and devices which can clearly cause early abortions. So, some exemptions were given right from the start. Exemptions from the contraceptive mandate. Religious employers are exempt from the mandate if they, I won't read it, but if they fall into a narrow category that's described in the IRS tax code. And it is rather narrow. It includes churches, integrated auxiliaries, conventions or associations of churches like the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, as well as the exclusively religious activities of religious orders. So it does not, the exemption does not include organizations like Catholic schools, for example, that cater to a wide number of people, or Catholic hospitals, for example. There was a great uproar over that, and so Health and Human Services agreed on a further accommodation for religious employers that are not exempt. And that rule states that religious organizations and institutions that are not exempted would not have to pay for the objectionable services. Instead, their insurance companies would be required to provide the objectionable services free of charge directly to the insured. So, for example, if you run a Catholic hospital and you hire somebody and your group plan is through United Mutual Insurance Company, I'm making that name up, right? You would not have to include contraceptives in their health plan, but United Mutual is going to provide it directly to the employee. And HHS claims that supplying those objectionable services directly to the insured will not involve any extra expense for the insurance companies, because they will save money on maternity care and other costs of unplanned pregnancy. So birth control is cheaper than babies, and so we're saying, we, the administration, are saying to you, the insurance company, you're going to have to provide these contraceptives and abortion-causing drugs, but they're not going to cost you anything in the long run because you're going to save money on things like maternity costs. the problems with this. Is that really going to be true, first of all? Is it not going to, notwithstanding the mentality of that, which is faulty to begin with, but is it really not going to involve any additional cost to the insurance companies? I've seen at least one study which says that it probably is going to involve extra cost. And, when you think about it, if it were that cost effective for insurance companies to provide free contraceptives, free abortion-causing drugs, well, why aren't they already doing it, right? Generally, insurance companies don't have to be forced to do things that are going to save them money, right? If there is additional cost, well, the funding stream for those services really be kept separate from the premiums of the religious employer. Okay, so supposedly any extra cost is not supposed to be passed on to the religious employer. Are those funding streams really going to be kept separate? I find it a little bit hard to believe that it will. Even if you could do that, the religious employer is still being forced to cooperate, because the trigger for receiving the contraceptives and abortion-causing drugs, if you are an employee of the religious employer, is, first of all, the fact that you have the contract with United Mutual in the first place, right? Second of all, the fact that you've hired the employee. And third of all, that you have to tell her Health and Human Services that you're not going to provide these services, and so that then triggers the provision of the services by the insurance company. So regardless of the accommodation, religious employers are still being forced to cooperate in the delivery of these quote-unquote services. Many religious employers realized that, and they took the Obama administration to court, as did some for-profit companies like Hobby Lobby. So most of you are probably aware that Hobby Lobby won its case. They specifically objected to the quote-unquote contraceptives which were abortifacient. They are owned by Christians who are not Catholic, and so they had no problem with providing contraceptives per se, but their problem was specifically with the abortifacient contraceptives, and the court ruled in favor of them. You get up-to-the-minute news at this conference. So in March, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on behalf of the Little Sisters of the Poor and 6 other nonprofit religious ministries. In other words, they were saying, we don't want to cooperate with the contraceptive mandate in any way. The accommodation is not a real accommodation. We don't want to cooperate in any way. And a ruling is expected next month in June. No one knows what's going to happen. It's possible that it will be a 4-4 ruling because of the death of Justice Scalia. That might allow the lower court rulings to stand. Lower courts have ruled against the Little Sisters, although the court may order the case to be re-argued when they have a 9th justice. So we're right on the cutting edge right now of this kind of question. And so we need to be thinking and praying about, oh, by the way, first, this is just a marvelous quote from one of the lawyers representing the Little Sisters of the Poor. Untold millions of people have managed to get contraceptives without the involvement of nuns. The idea that the most powerful government in the world cannot come up with a way to distribute these products without forcing the Little Sisters of the Poor to participate is ridiculous. Good. Boy, that makes me want to change the name and say it was my quote. Now, if they don't provide an adequate exemption, what do we do? And here is a question that I really don't have the answer to. Let me put the 2 possibilities up here. First of all, do we give in? Buy into insurance plans that pay for other members to practice contraception and to kill their children and grandchildren. Because remember, their dependents can stay on the plan until, I'm pretty sure it's age 26. And so they're going to be using these products as well. Or do we resist? Refuse to participate even if it means legal problems, fines, and difficulty receiving medical care. Part of me wants to say we all need to resist. But on the other hand, it's easy for me to say that because I don't have a wife, I don't have children who are going to need health care, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to be praying and thinking about what we're going to do. Right around the time of the contraceptive mandate, the bishops came out with a wonderful document that I suggest that you read. It's on their website, called A Statement on Religious Liberty, Our First Most Cherished Liberty. And this is what they said. If we face today the prospect of unjust laws, then Catholics in America, in solidarity with our fellow citizens, must have the courage not to obey them. No American desires this, no Catholic welcomes it. But if it should fall upon us and we must discharge it as a duty of citizenship, then we must discharge it as a duty of citizenship and an obligation of faith. Where is the point where we say enough? Religious liberty is eroding and I refuse to participate. We're certainly very close to that point in this country. So on that cheery note, I'll go to the end of life. I want to talk about three things: ordinary versus extraordinary means of preserving life, euthanasia and assisted suicide, legal trends at end of life. This is a little bit of a follow-up on Father Tad's talks yesterday, although he stuck mostly to the topic of brain death. You probably know the basic definition. Ordinary means of preserving life, according to the Church, means that offer benefits to the patient that are proportional to the burdens involved. Extraordinary means of preserving life that do not offer benefits to the patient that are proportional to the burdens involved. Some points about this distinction. It's a moral distinction and not a medical one. Very often, when doctors, for example, talk about ordinary means, they're talking about things that are readily available, commonly used, known to be effective, etc. When we talk about ordinary means, we mean something a little bit different. We're talking about the benefit to the patient relative to the burdens. This is a very important thing not to forget. It can be a great thing to use extraordinary means for a while until, for example, a priest can come and anoint the person. We never want to forget that when we're working with families. The judgment about whether something is ordinary or extraordinary should be made on the basis of the quality of the treatment in question and not the quality of the patient's life. This is a very commonly made mistake. Okay? So, for example, say you have a person with severe dementia, they are elderly, and they get pneumonia. Do you treat the pneumonia with antibiotics? Okay? Now, some people would say, well, their quality of life is so poor, their quality of life is so poor, that we might not give the antibiotics. The best way, the Catholic way of looking at this is, no, you look at the particular treatment. Normally, giving an antibiotic involves virtually no additional burden to the patient, right? So it would clearly be ordinary means. This was the mistake that was made with Terry Schiavo several years ago. A decision to withdraw the feeding tube was made on her overall quality of life, as opposed to the burdens and benefits of the treatment involved. The feeding tube was giving her no additional burden, right? And when the feeding tube was removed, she died, I think, 15 days later, and the cause of death was starvation and dehydration, right? So very important to make this decision based on the particular treatment that we're looking at and not on the overall quality of the patient's life. Related to this is the topics of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So withdrawing ordinary means is one way of doing euthanasia, okay? Withdrawing ordinary means. So euthanasia, an action or omission which of itself and by intention causes death in order that all suffering may be eliminated. Physician-assisted suicide, basically the same thing, only now the person is taking their own life with the help of usually the physician. Just to show you there's nothing new under the sun, here's Saint Augustine, who lived in the 300s and 400s, talking about assisted suicide. He says, "It is never licit to kill another, even if he should wish it. Indeed, even if he request it, because hanging between life and death, he begs for help in freeing the soul struggling against the bonds of the body and longing to be released." And isn't that amazing that this is a teaching that goes back 18th century, 17 or 18 centuries? A bit on the legality of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Oregon was the first state to legalize it in 1997. They legalized physician-assisted suicide. Washington State, since 2008, has had physician-assisted suicide. No one quite knows, I think, what the situation is in Montana. There's no law that has been passed, but the court said in 2009 that nothing in state law prohibits it. Vermont since 2013. I don't have California up here yet because their law has not taken effect. It will take effect shortly, so I'll have to I'll add them to the slide a little bit later this year. Other countries. Some people would say, well, Switzerland was far ahead. I would say they were way behind in this, because in 1942, they offered physician and non-physician assisted suicide, provided the person assists for unselfish reasons. Isn't that great? You know, you can help someone kill themselves as long as you're not selfish about it. Belgium, since 2002, as you may remember, March 2014, they removed their age restrictions. So, for example, a child with a severely debilitating disease who wants to be euthanized and has the consent of the parents can be killed according to Belgian law. The wisest in the pro-life movement many years ago said, once we accept the premise that there are some lives that are not worth living, then it's going to lead to killing the elderly, it's going to lead to killing children who are handicapped, etc. And very many people responded by saying, yeah, right. Well, Belgium is at least the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophecy. The Netherlands has had both voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide since 2002. It had been permitted by the courts since 1984. And then there are other places where it can happen and you may not be punished. I'm hearing more and more about it here in the United States, where, for example, a painkiller will be administered to a terminally ill patient in a high enough dosage that it causes death. You know, sometimes it's called stealth euthanasia. Luxembourg was a particularly tragic case. It was passed by the legislature and the Grand Duke refused to sign it. He vetoed it because he was Catholic. And so Parliament amended the Constitution so that the Grand Duke can no longer veto legislation, and then they passed it, which is amazing. Now, these people talk about autonomy and freedom, but if they don't get what they want, they'll stop at nothing to even change and reinterpret the Constitution of the place where they are to get euthanasia or assisted suicide. Arguments against. We could stop right there. Human life is inviolable. Even if it's a life of suffering, you know, and it's conducive to the common good, not only the individual good, but the common good, to invest life with dignity and to treat it that way. Erosion of patients' trust in their doctors as caregivers. Imagine being in a hospital, looking around at the doctors, thinking to yourself, up to a certain point, they're going to try and cure me. And after that point, they may try and kill me. And in fact, in the Netherlands right now, there are people who will not check into a hospital unless there is a contract saying that they will not be deliberately killed. Will undercut support for palliative medicine. Palliative medicine is a wonderful field that has to do with eliminating pain or managing pain at the end of life. Why give very much money to it if assisted suicide is legal, if euthanasia is legal, and it's much more cost-effective, right? Will lead to pressure on the sick and the aged to get out of the way. This was a quote that allegedly the governor of Colorado made some years ago. He later denied saying that. But the idea now that people, as they reach the end of their life, are going to feel pressured to not be a burden on their family, society, etc., just to get out of the way through assisted suicide or euthanasia. The slippery slope argument. If you start by assisted suicide or euthanasia to those who request it, eventually you're going to start doing it on people who are in comas or in quote-unquote persistent vegetative states, even if they have not requested it. And from there, you could actually go to involuntary euthanasia, where it would be against the will of the person. Okay? Already, in the Netherlands, there are more people being euthanized who have not asked for it than who have asked for it. So this slippery slope is already very much in play. Fortunately, John Paul II is not as long-winded as I am. Puts it very simply. I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God. Last thing I want to mention is some things having to do with research, bioethics. I'll just touch on some latest things in stem cell research, cloning, genetic engineering. Stem cells, I think most of you know, definition, immature cells that can develop into a wide variety of cell types. So there are adult stem cells. You all have stem cells in your bodies, for example, in your bone marrow. In most of the organs of your body, although they're hard to get to, they're hard to isolate sometimes. And then there are embryonic stem cells, cells that are the inner cells of an embryo during early human development. So here's how you get embryonic stem cells. You have a new human life, generally that came from in vitro fertilization. You grow him or her to the blastocyst stage, 5 to 7 days or so after fertilization. And then these inner cells here are called stem cells because they can develop into any kind of cell in the human body, heart cells, muscle cells, liver cells, etc. So then what you do is you break up the embryo and you take these stem cells, and in 1998 they figured out a way to culture these so that you can put them in culture, you can treat them with different things, and they will develop into, let's say, heart cells or neurons or immune cells, etc. Right? And people were very enthusiastic about using these kind of cells in clinical therapy because supposedly they can give rise to any kind of cell. Now, what's the obvious problem with this? You have to kill the embryo to get the stem cells, right? And again, even if you have to kill one human embryo to save 100,000 people, human beings are ends in themselves. They are not means. They are persons to be loved and not objects to be used. On the other hand, adult stem cells are being used very successfully in therapies. In fact, in the year 2015, we went over the 1 million mark. Over 1 million patients have now been treated with adult stem cell therapies. Here are some of the things that can be treated using adult stem cell therapies. However, some people actually have good intentions. They're doing something evil, but they have good intentions when they work with embryonic stem cells because they think that embryonic stem cells will give us the most information about how embryos normally or naturally develop. Okay? So they might have a good intention, but they're doing something evil, whereas adult stem cell therapy can be very, very good, and the Church actually supports it. The Vatican, as well as many dioceses, have actually monetarily, financially supported adult stem cell research. This is one of my favorite little stories. This scientist, Shinya Yamanaka, was one of the people who was using early human embryos in his research. And one day he visited his friend in a fertility clinic in Japan, and his friend allowed him to look through the microscope at one of the human embryos that his friend was working on. And he looked into the microscope and had this amazing thought that occurred to him. He said, "When I saw the embryo, I suddenly realized there was such a small difference between it and my daughters." He had, I think, 2 daughters at the time. "I thought, we can't keep destroying embryos for our research. There must be another way." And so he started doing research into getting mature cells to actually develop backwards so that they would be a little bit like embryonic stem cells, which would then offer an alternative for research. And not only was he successful, but he was so successful that he and his partner won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in the year 2012. Beautiful example of how, things work out if you do them the right way. If you do what's truly good, God is going to take care of you. Now, more recently than that, in fact, this is just 2015, it's actually been shown that you can get mature cells to cross-differentiate into other kinds of mature cells without even going through an immature stage first. That was a tremendous discovery as well. So the point is, adult stem cell therapies have been shown to work. There are other ways of getting cells that are like embryonic stem cells for research, and so there's simply no compelling reason to continue this morally evil way of doing research by killing embryos to get their stem cells. say a couple of things about human cloning. I won't go through all of this, but the point is that you basically do the same thing that we saw in the last slide. So you have the embryo growing to the blastocyst stage, and then you kill the embryo to get stem cells. Only now you've started with a cloning procedure so that these stem cells will be genetically identical, theoretically, to the patient who you cloned. Right? And some people said this will be a wonderful way to get patient-specific stem cells for therapy. And this has actually been done. Now, this was done for the first time in 2013, where they cloned a human being, grew the embryo to the blastocyst stage, killed the embryo, and developed stem cells from it. Okay, so a human embryos have been cloned and killed. So far as anyone knows, no one has implanted a human clone and tried to bring it to term. But human beings have been cloned. Human embryos have been cloned and then killed at the blastocyst stage to get their stem cells. And that's what this paper announces. Human embryonic stem cells derived by somatic cell nuclear transfer, which is a way of cloning. Why is this bad? There are so many reasons that I almost couldn't fit them all on the slide. This is the most basic one. Like in vitro fertilization, for example, it replaces the conjugal act with a technical procedure. Whoever thought that the loving embrace of a man and woman could ever be replaced by the actions of technicians in a laboratory? And that's what we're doing when we do IVF. That's what we're doing when we clone. A logic of production that violates the dignity of the child. It's almost like a quality control procedure when you think of it. You create all these embryos, you look at the unhealthy ones, you throw them away, you use the healthy ones for implantation or for research. So if you make the quality control cut, we're going to invest you with dignity. Otherwise, you have no dignity, and we're just going to discard you. A logic of production results in the killing of quote-unquote spare embryos. Again, I put it in quotes because there's no such thing as excess life, right? Every single life is important. Just to give you an idea, when they cloned the first puppy a few years ago, they had to create over 1,000 cloned dog embryos before they got one successful birth. Okay? So just imagine how many human embryos are going to be killed as we continue with cloning research, if we continue with cloning research. Biological slavery, a tyranny of cloner over clone. So if I'm cloned and the embryo is created so that they can get stem cells that will match me perfectly, that's a form of biological slavery. This clone is in an inferior position, and I'm treating this just as biological material instead of an individual with dignity. Exploitation of poor women to obtain human ova. Where are you going to obtain hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human ova? Well, I'll tell you how you'll do it. I was in the Philippines for 9 years. You'll go to the Philippines, you'll put up signs saying, we'll pay you 500 pesos per ovum. And so poor women will be exploited to obtain the ova that are necessary. It involves killing even the quote-unquote good embryos to get their stem cells, right? Which is even worse when you think about it. Killing them is even worse than implanting them would be, because you're directly killing innocent human life. This so-called therapeutic cloning will lead to reproductive cloning. So even if we say, well, we're only going to do it and we're going to kill the embryos and get their stem cells, well, somebody eventually is going to say, well, let's implant some of them and see what happens. So then you'll have reproductive cloning, which also violates the dignity of the child, because the child cannot consent to this experiment of being a clone, and it will result in role problems for cloned children. Is this my twin, or is this my mother? In one sense, she's genetically identical to me. She's like my identical twin. In the other sense, my life came from her, so she's sort of like my mother. So you could be the daughter or son of your identical twin and the son or daughter of your grandfather. Huge role problems if we start doing this reproductively. Higher rates of birth defects and handicaps expected. Dolly, the first cloned sheep, got arthritis at a young age. No one is sure why, but it seems very likely to me that it's because, although Dolly was newly conceived, they used a nucleus from an older sheep. So you have old genes in new life. It's sort of like putting old wine into new wineskins. So here's how the church puts it in one of her official documents, Dignitas Personae. If human cloning were to be done for reproduction, this would impose on the resulting individual a predetermined genetic identity, subjecting him, as has been stated, to a form of biological slavery. From the ethical point of view, so-called therapeutic cloning, where you clone the embryo and kill the embryo to get the stem cells, is even more serious. To create embryos with the intention of destroying them, even with the intention of helping the sick, is completely incompatible with human dignity. All right, last thing I want to talk about is just some recent things in genetic engineering. Cas9 is a protein that was discovered in bacteria. In fact, it was a yogurt company that initially noticed this, that their bacteria had ways of remembering viruses that had infected the bacteria and cutting the viral DNA at a certain point with an enzyme. And that's what Cas9 does. And somebody realized, hey, we could use this as a method of genetic engineering. So you take that protein, you attach it to a small molecule of RNA, which tells the protein where to go, and then you can basically cut DNA pretty much wherever you want to cut it, and splice in a gene of your choice. That's what this technology called CRISPR-Cas9 allows you to do. How many have heard of CRISPR-Cas9? It's appearing more and more in different articles that you'll see now. Now, this could be used to do a couple of things. It's been used with a variety of plant and animals so far. Like, for example, they took dogs, and by using this technique, they ended up with dogs which were extra muscular by using, I guess, a muscle protein and splicing it in to the dog's DNA. It has been tried on human embryos by a Chinese group, again, just within the last year. And here's the name of that paper, CRISPR-Cas9 mediated gene editing in human tripronuclear zygotes. So they tested this with human embryos. It did not work as well in human beings as it did with animals, and they're not sure why, but not all of the embryos were transformed with this DNA that they spliced in. Even the ones that were transformed, all of the cells weren't transformed, and there were also off-target cuts where the enzyme cut DNA in places that it wasn't supposed to cut the DNA. But the point is, human embryos have been genetically engineered and then killed. Okay, so again, so far as anybody knows, no one has genetically engineered a human being and implanted him or her and tried to bring him or her to term, but using CRISPR-Cas9, human embryos have been genetically engineered and then killed. Believe it or not, the church is not against all genetic engineering in principle. In fact, the church has said that somatic cell genetic engineering, in principle, can be good if the safety factor is there and if informed consent is obtained. By somatic cell genetic engineering, we mean modifying the DNA in order to cure a disease of somatic cells, like heart cells or lung cells. When we talk about germline genetic engineering, we're talking about genetically engineering sperm, eggs, or early embryos. Right? So two different kinds of genetic engineering. The latter, germline genetic engineering, passes on those traits to any offspring. Somatic cell genetic engineering does not, because you're looking at lung cells, heart cells, cells that are not early embryos, sperm, or eggs. So the church says, procedures used on somatic cells for strictly therapeutic purposes are in principle morally licit. Such actions seek to restore the normal genetic configuration of the patient or to counter damage caused by genetic anomalies or those related to other pathologies. Procedures used on, the moral evaluation of germline genetic therapy is different. whatever genetic modifications are effected on the germ cells of a person will be transmitted to any potential offspring. It also needs to be added that this only takes place in the context of in vitro fertilization, which is wrong to begin with. For these reasons, therefore, it must be stated that in its current state, germline cell therapy in all its forms is morally illicit. So a basic distinction between somatic cell genetic therapy and germline genetic therapy. The Church has kind of given a cautious okay in principle to somatic cell genetic therapy and a big red light to germline genetic therapy. Okay, it's about time for me to stop, but I just want to leave you with this thought. I think a lot of these problems come from what Pope John Paul II called an overly individualistic view of freedom. Right? Another way of saying it is a perverted view of autonomy. In other words, when we lose our sense of God and our relation to God, and it's just us, then my moral choices become a question of exercising my rights over and above the rights of those who are going to be weaker and who are not going to be effective at getting what they want. And that's really what has happened in some of these negative applications. Embryos are weak, right? They can't defend themselves. They can't fight for their rights. Terminally ill people are weak. They can't fight for their rights. Unborn children are weak. They can't defend themselves. They can't fight for their rights. So once you lose your sense of God and man, now it becomes very easy for us to simply eliminate them from the equation, because freedom now becomes a question of my rights over and against the rights of others who are not as powerful as me. So the only way we're going to get any sanity in some of these areas is by regaining that sense of God and man. And that's why I think Pope Francis is right on target in focusing on evangelization, focusing on the joy of the gospel, focusing on the need for people to know Christ, because there really is a conversion of heart that's necessary in order for many people to see the obvious truth that we have seen here. So let's pray for that, and let's work for that, and let's end with a glory be. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Saint Joseph, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you for viewing our program. Please see our website, divinemercymatters.org, for additional educational resources. Thank you.